All right, everybody. Please welcome to the virtual stage, Penny, to talk about background services. Let me pin you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, to kick things off, let me preface this by saying this is intended to be a discussion. If there is very little discussion, this will be shorter than the allotted time. If there's a lot of discussion, we can continue in side channel to discuss the problems and opportunities. So I do have a few slides to kind of kick things off and get everyone thinking about this space. Then we'll see what thoughts everyone has from there. Just in terms of folks I know who are thinking about this space, I'm Penny. I'm a product manager at Google Chrome. Riley and Dan are both software engineers on the capabilities team who have been thinking a lot about this space. Ben is another product manager on Google Chrome. Unfortunately, Ben and Dan can't be here, and I want to give a special thanks to Riley for scribing this for us, which is a doc that we'll make publicly available after the presentation. So I want to start with some definitions of what we might mean by background services, because I think that there are two types of background services, and we are here to discuss both, even though from a technical perspective, what this implies is quite different. So one is services that might need to run when the tab isn't running. So this could be things like the browser itself is open, the tab is closed. Let's imagine something like rendering a video file, which is going to be a long running background task. If this was being done in a native application, we could imagine that the user might close the window of this application and expect that that job is going to continue to run in the background. And this, of course, is a little bit operating system dependent. People have different expectations on different operating systems. Closing all windows and expecting the application to continue running tends to be more of a Mac thing, but it isn't exclusively a Mac thing. We do see long-running long-running tasks on Windows. Typically, they have a system tree icon or some other indicator that work is happening, but it is a use case. The second is services that might need to run when the browser isn't running at all. And so this is stuff like notifications arriving in the background or expecting downloads to complete, even when the browser isn't running. And again, we have examples of native apps that may have this behavior where there is no visible application window. From the user's perspective, they may have quit that application, but they still expect tasks to run. Now, the goal for this discussion today is to understand whether or not we have user problems that we can align against. I'm in I would say the fairly early stages of exploring this space. Obviously, there's a lot of prior art here, including ship features like background fetch and background sync that serve to meet some of these needs, but may not be complete solutions to all of the problems that exist out there. So why might we want to work on these from the user perspective? Well, one of those reasons is platform perception and branding. Users today do tend to think of web apps as being less capable than native apps. We've closed a lot of that gap with Fugu, actually a tremendous amount of that gap. But generally, we do still find that if users told something is a website, they'll think it's worse. And while this may be rooted more in user perception than reality, there is some reality here still. And one of those outstanding items is more complete background services than what we currently support on the web. And in some, there are some good reasons why we don't support those. And so there's some challenging aspects of problems, which I've also got covered a little bit later in the presentation. So to give another example of a kind of an exact user problem is maybe PWA should not exit when the browser does. Now this again is a kind of a platform specific problem in as much as Chrome on say Chrome OS is always running, so PWAs do not exit. Even if the user has a tab Chrome window open on Chrome OS and they quit that, obviously PWAs are still running. But if a user has installed a standalone PWA, they may no longer associate that with Chrome itself, and they may be surprised if that application quits when Chrome exits. And they may be even more surprised if that means that they're not receiving notifications from, say, a calendar app or a chat app like Slack or Google Chat, and WhatsApp, or any number of other fairly popular apps that are used in a standalone mode. And so that can be a problem, both from the perspective of the user not expecting this app to quit at all, and also if it disappeared on them in the background and they're no longer getting notifications, they may be missing important things, which is going to contribute to their perception that the web apps just aren't as good, and to go looking for things like the Electron version of these applications when they exist, and possibly move to a version, kind of a flavor of the app that we would prefer they didn't use. So we want to keep them in the browser. We want to keep them using the open web flavor of the web app. Then perhaps we should be addressing these issues. Users are familiar with native apps working when Windows, or like when the application itself doesn't seem to be running, or the application itself doesn't seem to have any open windows. I already gave that example of kind of rendering video audio. We can imagine in the future this might include LLM, either training LLM models or running, doing kind of any compute heavy AI tasks. Things like data synchronization. A lot of mail clients, like say Outlook, will continue to synchronize mail in the background. Or for example, if you're using a cloud file service, you might expect things like Dropbox to be continuing to synchronize files, even though there's no open window from that service running. There are other things like peripheral event listeners and preprocessors, so configurations basically for peripherals that users expect to continue running always, even if there's no application window from that particular device. We can think here of like devices like styluses, or input tablets like Wacom tablets, etc., where the user may be expecting that there is software that was provided by the vendor that's always running, that is doing interpretations or applying configurations to events coming in from those devices. There's things like scheduled jobs, alarms, cron-like services that run certain tasks, and of course, more native feeling notifications, which would continue to arrive even when the app is not running. So this is the notification example is kind of an interesting one, because there's some differences in behavior there. It's not like we can say that there's one consistent thing. Desktop, like Slack, for example, last time I've used the desktop version of it, it did not support back like notifications when Slack wasn't running. So we do have some examples of desktop users expecting notifications to quit when the app is quit. So there's contradictory evidence there, an interesting area for discussion. In terms of the challenges, historically, one of which is prioritizing these user problems, like how significant are these? How can we learn more about whether or not these are really barriers to, like, are these really influencing users' perspective of the capability of the web? Are these really influencing developer decision-making of whether or not to build on the open web, or whether or not to use Electron, or whether or not to use some native framework? So those are, that's a big open question for me. As I said, early in the exploratory phase, I'm hoping to collect more evidence from partners and from users and from developers to better understand the problem space. But right now we're kind of in 2024 prioritization mode. I'm trying to understand whether or not there is sort of a there that we should be exploring. So happy to have that discussion here today. And then of course there's this challenge, which is one of the reasons why past investigations or even features that we've shipped around working in the background have had to either be designed very carefully or didn't ship at all. The aspects of this challenge, one, informing users about the potential for resource consumption, as well as complexity of explaining the permission opt-in journey to the user in a way that lets them make an informed decision that is not disruptive to the experience. Minimizing and governing the actual resources that are needed, so that we don't have something that the user has difficulty finding using, say 100% of CPU, or paging foreground applications out of memory, consuming a pile of network. We want to be able to communicate effectively to users on when active resource consumption is happening. Kind of to doomsday type scenario is, front page article, Chrome sucking user battery life, and or resources in the background, especially if it's being used by some nefarious site to, do Bitcoin mining. this brings me to the next slide, which of course, like, is abuse risk. Obviously, huge potential for abuse in any case where we have the potential to harness system resources in a way that that may not be immediately visible and obvious to a user. And the user might have a limited ability to either detect or intervene or revert decisions. So obviously, huge abuse risk potential here. That is my last slide. So I've sort of like laid out the problem space as I see it, a little bit of the opportunity, and I'm going to pause there and just see if folks have initial thoughts or feedback.
All right. Any feedback from the audience or from the virtuals? Yep, we got one from the audience.
Hey, Vinny, thanks for the great overview of the problem space. It's something we've all thought about for a long time. I can tell you that from the Microsoft perspective, we do have internal customers who experience that FOMO of moving from a native app to a PWA, specifically because they will not be able to maintain a presence in the what do we call it? The tray, the task tray.
System tray.
And provide affordances for users to interact with their service after that. I don't have an intuition as to whether or not they actually need things to run a long time in the background. Like the question of, can we keep the evented model and simply shut down the PWA itself while we maintain its presence, I think is an open question. Is that right, Natasha? Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Okay, we have another question from the audience.
Just a question about abuse risk. Do you consider privacy one of those as well? Because I know on mobile platforms, they have a lot of options for like only allow location services while the app is foregrounded and running. Is that another potential abuse that, you know, should be accounted for?
Absolutely. Yeah. The fact that something could be doing, sort of any sort of tracking in the background without being immediately obvious and visible to the user. I could imagine even like, take advantage of a permission, like a permission grant, like a location grant to continue sending location in the background would be a huge one. And, there may be less obvious, but still really concerning attacks that could be done. If, for example, there was some way that the running app could look at, infer CPU pressure or other issues going on with the device, and that might be, there might be various nefarious ways of reporting information back. So yes, absolutely.
And then one more question just on the topic of mobile. I know they have much more limited constraints as to when they can run in the background. Is this something that works, like what is the story here on mobile? I'm actually kind of curious.
Maybe there's someone on Clank who could run me through like in more detail. So my understanding is we're just much more proactive about effectively sort of tab freezing. And that like at the end, in terms of like what in Chrome and other apps at the Android level get pressure from the operating system to run on a very limited but like essentially budget and can be frozen on page out of memory at any time. But perhaps someone who works directly on Clank can comment.
For folks who are talking in the room and asking questions, from a note-taking perspective, could you introduce yourself first?
Okay, yeah, the first person was Alex Russell. The second person was Kurt Caddy Schmidt.
I think it's a good point about the mobile environment, and perhaps we can learn more about what sorts of pressure Android puts on apps running its ecosystem and learn from that. There is that question of like desktop environments are a little bit different than mobile, and so I think there's a question in my mind of, do we behave differently when we know that the device, for example, is plugged into AC power, and we have fewer concerns about energy usage? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should, sort of be just as careful no matter what the power source is, because energy is energy. But it's certainly an area that we want to reason about in anything we design.
All right, we have Alex Russell again. 1 second.
Thanks. It's just worth noting that in the context of periodic background sync, which is the, I think, most aggressive that we've gone so far with regards to this, the heuristics that I think we implemented for Android are that you have to be frequently used. And in fact, we will allow you to do background synchronization on a sort of degrading curve based on frequency of use. That's captured, I think, in site engagement score, among other things, as well as constraints around being on high power or enough power and being on what we hope is an unmetered network. And so those are places where the APIs are already constrained in ways that may not be visible, and we may not be doing a good job about telling users that those are things that we're guarding on their behalf, but it's an opportunity.
Okay. Another comment from the audience, from Eric Anderson.
Yeah, obviously a lot of this is potentially affected by UX. I think the background fetch API is a great example of something that gets a more app-like experience. If I want to download a movie for viewing on the airplane later, I don't want to have to proactively watch my browser. Is the tab still active? Is it still running? But I think that's been wired up into the download UX such that if the browser's closing, it can let the user know, hey, there's a download pending. If they forgot about it, they might be able to spot that UX. So a lot of this feels like a scenario by scenario thing to think about. Hey, could we explain it to a user? Do we need an API that's more constrained? So worry less about privacy, about it doing things in the background if we can constrain it to exactly what the user probably actually wants it doing. So, yep.
Agree that it's scenario by scenario. I think as a follow-up, if folks who are interested in sort of exploring what those scenarios are or who have scenarios in mind would like to ping me, and we can kind of continue the discussion offline. That would be very helpful.
All right, we have another comment from the audience.
Hi, this is Rob Paveza from Microsoft. Thank you, Penny, for the discussion. A couple of things pop into mind. The first is obviously, I think the user experience. I think of the analog of like Windows services, which are just horrible to figure out if one is running away, how to shut it down, especially if you're not an administrator, which I would suppose is not going to be so much of an issue because all of this would run in userland. But if it's running away, obviously we would want a way to detect that being something that we could kind of constrain. So that would be something I think maybe there's some kind of heuristics or limit, aggressive limitation on user resources that could be consumed. So that's one thing that's top of mind. The second is how would one think about debugging the background services, especially when you're unattached? I'd want to make sure that this could be a good experience for the developer who's creating these services. In the past, service workers have been something of a challenge. I think we've gotten through that now, and I think we're pretty well in a good state. But I would also want to make sure that we're being aggressive about making sure that we know what we're debugging when we're working on these.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, on your first comment about how difficult it is to find runaway system services, absolutely. I mean, the sort of ideas that I've already been thinking about are stuff like requiring that there be a system tray icon or the Mac equivalent of the system tray icon. So there would be sort of a universal browser icon, and underneath that icon it would list any and all origins that are specifically using background services and provide some user understandable detail about how significant that resource consumption was. And we could even think about things like if a particular resource has been using, say, more than a certain amount of CPU for a certain amount of time or goes over a memory limit, that there's a higher priority notification, either changing the color of the the system tray icon, or something else to elevate the user's awareness that there's something happening there. A notification in the worst case, although and I mean, I don't know that any of these are necessarily good ideas, or that they will be sufficient. But I think there's some room for exploration in terms of providing visual indications of resource consumption and usage and risk to the user. On the second question, that's a great question. I've not thought a lot about how developer tooling could work for this. Perhaps we can take lessons from how debugging works in Service Worker. That it probably would be fairly similar. And some of these services may explicitly be hooked to the Service Worker.
Right, Andy on remote.
Yeah, the core concept of having something in the tray or something like that seems super valuable. One of the problems that we kind of see in a similar world with Edge's WebView 2 is like folks opening Task Manager and seeing, oh, there's some processes that they're seeing edge.exe or chrome.exe that they can't attribute that. And they're just saying oh, there's some background app on behalf that we're open on behalf of, but they're blaming us because they see the naming. So there's some attribution aspects across every OS that I think will be valuable to make sure that folks are, attributing and blaming if that's the right thing around resource consumption, that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
As a question, what's the right engagement? What's the right way to reach out, Penny? Because I think I have a handful of related experiences that I'd love to kind of chat about and see if we can share notes.
For sure. If you don't already have my email, just ping me on the BlinkOn Slack channel, and I'll pass it your way.
Sounds good.
Right, do we have any other comments from the audience? Looks like no. All right, we're done. Thank you very much, Penny.
Thank you.